The worn planks of the porch creaked beneath the weight of 70 years and a lifetime of choices. Ethan Brooks sat in the rocking chair he'd built with his own hands 3 decades ago, the wood smooth now from countless evenings just like this one. March in the Catskills still carried winter's bite even in 2024. Steam rose from his coffee mug in lazy spirals disappearing into air that smelled of thawing earth and pine. The truck appeared at the edge of the tree line, crawling up the dirt road that wound through the forest. Ethan knew who it was before the vehicle came to a stop. He'd been expecting this visit for 18 years, ever since the day his grandson Carter was born. Some things in life followed patterns as reliable as the seasons. Carter climbed out of the passenger side shoulders, hunched against more than just the cold. The boy carried a black trash bag over one shoulder. Everything he owned, Ethan knew, reduced to what could fit in a garbage bag. The same way it had been for Ethan once 52 years ago, when the world had given him nothing but a deadline and a door closing behind him. The boy's face was pale, eyes hollow, with the kind of fear that came from standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go but down. Ethan recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once, standing on cracked concrete steps in a different lifetime, feeling the cold seep through worn sneakers, while the only family he had left pressed her small hand against a wire mesh window. "So they kicked you out on your birthday," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Carter nodded, unable to speak. His throat worked, but no words came. "Come here, boy, sit down." Ethan gestured to the chair beside him, the one that had been waiting empty since Sarah died. "I'm going to tell you a story about the day I stood where you're standing now, about the man who saved me, and about this rusted metal box you see behind us." The Quonset hut rose behind them, no longer the corroded wreck it had been in 1972. New windows caught the afternoon light. A proper door stood where twisted metal had once hung. Fresh paint covered what rust hadn't surrendered to 50 years of patient restoration. But beneath all that work, beneath all those years, it was still the same curved shell that had appeared to Ethan through the trees like a miracle he didn't know he needed. Ethan opened the leather journal on his lap. The binding cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. His grandfather's handwriting filled every page, precise and steady, the script of a man who worked with his hands and believed that words like wood should be crafted with care. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother, William Brooks. He wrote in it for 30 years, and on the first page he left me a letter that changed everything." Carter leaned forward, drawn despite himself. Ethan closed the journal and set it aside. "But that comes later. First you need to understand where I was, who I was, so you'll understand what he gave me." The old man's eyes went distant, looking past the trees, past the years, to a March day in 1972, when the world had been nothing but gray sky and grayer possibilities. 52 years ago today, I turned 18. The memory rose up vivid and sharp, as clear as if it had been yesterday. Northwood Group Homes sat squat and institutional on the eastern edge of a town that had given up pretending it cared. The building was brick and cement, built in an era when warmth was considered a luxury and comfort a weakness. Ethan had lived there for 6 years, ever since the accident that took his parents. 6 years of knowing he was temporary, unwanted, warehoused, until the state could legally wash its hands of him. March 15th, 1972, his 18th birthday. The sky hung low and colorless, the kind of late winter day in upstate New York, where the clouds pressed down like a weight on your chest. What snow remained had forgotten it was supposed to be white, turned to gray slush that clung to the shadows and refused to melt or leave. Every few minutes the wind would gust, cutting through his thin jacket like it was hunting for bone. Ethan stood on the concrete steps, cracked from decades of freeze and thaw, and felt the cold rising through the worn soles of his sneakers. Behind him, the door to Northwood clicked shut. Not slammed, not dramatic, just a quiet, final little sound. The sound of an account being closed. The sound of a problem solved. He was officially an adult now, officially homeless. Mrs. Brennan, his caseworker, had handed him 2 things as he'd signed the final paperwork: a black trash bag containing everything he owned, and an envelope with $250 inside his final disbursement from the state. "Happy birthday, Ethan," she'd said in a voice as flat and gray as the sky. She might have been reading a grocery list. Use it wisely. Then she had handed him a second envelope, this one manila and official looking. "This came from the county probate office. Something your grandfather left you." His grandfather, William Brooks, a man Ethan barely remembered, a tall, silent presence from childhood who smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco. William had died in 1971, a year before Ethan's parents were killed in the accident that had sent him and Riley into the system. The timing had always felt like a cruel cosmic joke, the universe taking his family in installments. Ethan clutched the envelope, the paper already growing damp in the freezing mist. Behind him through the wire mesh window of the common room, he could see his sister Riley. She was 12 years old. Her face was pressed against the glass, her expression a perfect heartbreaking mirror of the fear he felt clawing at his own chest. They couldn't say goodbye. It was a rule. No prolonged emotional displays, disruptive to the routine. So they just looked at each other across that final distance. Riley's small hand was flat against the glass finger spread. Ethan wanted to press his own hand to the other side, wanted to tell her he'd come back, wanted to promise her something, anything. But he was already on the other side of the wall. He was out. She was still in. That single pane of glass felt like 100 miles of empty highway. The trash bag was light. A few pairs of jeans, some t-shirts worn soft and thin. A book his mother used to read to him at bedtime, the cover held together with tape. A framed photograph, the only one he had, of the four of them at a county fair. Mom, Dad, Riley, and Ethan all squinting into the sun, all smiling. His grandfather was in the background of that photo, a tall figure holding a cone of cotton candy for Riley, his kind eyes crinkled at the corners. $250. It was supposed to be his start, his launch into the adult world. It felt like just enough money to starve slowly, not nearly enough to live. Ethan walked away from Northwood without looking back, because if he looked back, he knew he would see Riley's face and he wouldn't be able to take another step. He'd just stand there frozen until the cold welded him to the sidewalk. The bus station was 10 blocks through streets that all looked the same. Gray buildings hunched under gray sky. The wind was personal in its cruelty, finding every gap in his jacket, every exposed inch of skin. By the time he reached the station, his face was numb and his fingers had lost most of their feeling. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of industrial disinfectant, trying to cover the deeper smell of human despair. Ethan sat on a hard plastic bench and opened the manila envelope with hands that shook from more than just cold. The letterhead read Harrison Caldwell, attorney at law, followed by an address in a town called Millbrook Falls, somewhere deep in the Catskills. The letter itself was dense with legal language, the kind of writing designed to make simple things sound impossibly complicated. But Ethan was good at puzzles. He'd spent 6 years in the group home learning to read between lines to find the truth hiding beneath official language. His grandfather, William Brooks, had left him something. Not money, property. Specifically, Lot 7B, a 2.5-acre parcel of unincorporated land in the mountains west of here. To claim the deed, Ethan had to appear in person at Mr. Caldwell's office and pay the outstanding property taxes and transfer fees. The total came to $5. $5 for 2.5 acres of land. Ethan read the line 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. Land wasn't $5. A greasy slice of pizza at the station kiosk was almost $5. There had to be a mistake. Or a catch. Probably the land was worthless. Probably it was contaminated or perched on the side of a cliff or cursed by ancient spirits. Attached to the letter was a grainy, photocopied satellite image of the property. A smudgy square of gray surrounded by darker gray that Ethan assumed was forest. In the center of the lot sat a single structure, a long curved shape like a loaf of metal bread dropped in the middle of nowhere. The caption beneath the image read, Quonset hut military surplus circa 1945. Ethan had seen pictures of Quonset huts in history books, semicircular buildings made of corrugated metal built during the war and then repurposed as barns or workshops when the soldiers came home. This one looked abandoned, forgotten. The image was too low quality to see details, but even through the blur, Ethan could sense the neglect. Maybe that's why the land was $5. Maybe it wasn't land at all. Maybe it was a liability they were desperate to unload. His first instinct was to throw the letter away. It was a distraction from what he needed to focus on. He needed a plan. He needed to find a job, find a room, start saving money so he could hire a lawyer and fight for Riley. The state didn't care about keeping siblings together once one of them aged out. Ethan was on his own. Riley was on a countdown. In 6 years, she'd be standing on those same concrete steps with her own trash bag facing her own gray future. The thought was a physical pain, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. But the letter wouldn't leave his mind. $5. It was less than 3 hours of work at minimum wage. The whole thing was probably a scam or a joke, but it was also a gamble he could almost afford. What was the alternative? Spending his $250 on a week in a grimy motel before ending up in a shelter anyway. At least the land, worthless as it probably was, represented something. A destination, a place that wasn't a shelter. The idea of owning something, anything, even just a patch of dirt with a metal can rusting on it, was a tiny seed that began to grow in the barren soil of his fear. Over the crackling intercom, a voice announced boarding for the bus, heading south toward the city, towards shelters and the anonymous brutal grind that every caseworker had warned him about, toward the place where kids like him disappeared and were never heard from again. On a different platform, another bus sat idling. Its destination sign was lit up with a series of small town names. One of them Ethan recognized from the lawyer's letterhead. Millbrook Falls. It was a choice. A real one. Maybe the first real choice he'd been allowed to make in 6 years. Go toward the expected miserable future. Or take a $5 chance on a ghost. Ethan looked at the photograph of his family one more time. His grandfather was there in the background, that tall, quiet man with carpenter's hands and kind eyes. William Brooks had been a practical man, a builder. He'd taught Ethan how to tie proper knots, how to read a compass, how to sand wood with the grain instead of against it. A man who builds things never does it without a reason, Ethan, his grandfather had said once while they were constructing a birdhouse in his workshop. Remember that? Ethan had been 9 years old, more interested in the smell of sawdust than in whatever lesson was being taught. But he remembered the words now. His grandfather wasn't a man who played cruel jokes. If he'd left Ethan this land, there had to be a reason. Ethan stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked to the ticket counter with the trash bag slung over his shoulder and bought a one-way ticket to a town he'd never seen to claim a piece of land that was probably worth less than the paper the deed was printed on. It was the stupidest, most reckless thing he'd ever done. It would turn out to be the best decision of his life. The bus ride felt like descending into another world. The vehicle rattled its way out of the city's gray orbit, past skeletal strip malls and abandoned factories, into the rolling, empty expanse of the Catskill Mountains. For hours, Ethan watched the landscape transform. The trees grew thicker, darker, more ancient. The hills steepened into real mountains. Patches of dirty snow clung to shadowed hollows, the last stubborn remnants of a winter that refused to surrender. The other passengers were mostly older people, their faces carved with the quiet resignation that came from lives lived in places the rest of the world forgot. No one spoke to Ethan. He was just another kid with a bag, another ghost passing through. For once, being invisible didn't feel like punishment. It felt like armor. At a rest stop halfway to Millbrook Falls, Ethan used a payphone to call Riley. They weren't supposed to have contact for the first 30 days after he aged out. Another rule, but Ethan had memorized the number of the payphone down the hall from Riley's dormitory room, and he knew she'd be waiting there at this exact time. They'd planned it in whispers in the few moments when the staff wasn't watching. The phone rang twice before Riley picked up. "Ethan?" Her voice was small, shaky. "Is that you?" "It's me, Riles. Are you okay? Where are you? They said you were gone." "I am. I'm on a bus. I'm going somewhere." He tried to make it sound like a plan, like an adventure instead of a desperate gamble. Where Ethan told her about the letter from their grandfather, about the land in the mountains, about the strange metal building. He tried to sell it to her, to himself, as something more than it probably was. "It's our own place, Riley, a real place. It's got a building on it and everything. A building like a house." "Sort of," Ethan hedged. "It's sturdy, made of metal." There was a pause. He could hear her thinking, trying to picture it in her mind. "Does it have a roof?" Ethan's voice cracked with a laugh he didn't quite feel. "Yeah, it's pretty much all roof." "Is it far?" "Yeah, it's far, but I'm going to fix it up. I'm going to make it a home, and then I'm going to come for you, I promise." It was a wild, impossible promise, and they both knew it. He was 18 with $200 and a $5 deed to worthless land. The legal battle to get custody of a sibling was a mountain he couldn't even see the base of. But he had to say it. She had to hear it. "I know," Riley whispered. "Be safe, Ethan." "You too, Riles. I love you. I love you too." The line went dead. Ethan stood there in the cold rest stop, holding the receiver long after the dial tone started buzzing in his ear like an angry insect. The weight of that promise settled onto his shoulders. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her. It had always been about her. Millbrook Falls looked like a town that time had forgotten and time had been content to let it go. The main street was lined with brick and stone buildings that hadn't been updated since the 1950s. Faded signs advertised businesses that might or might not still exist. A few people moved along the sidewalks, bundled against the cold, their faces carrying the patient weariness of people who'd learned not to expect much from life. The lawyer's office was in a three-story brick building with Harrison Caldwell's name painted in gold letters on a second-floor window. The paint was fading, but the letters were still legible. Barely, Ethan climbed a narrow staircase that smelled of old wood and older carpet. The office door was solid oak with a frosted glass panel. He knocked once, heard a voice call for him to enter, and stepped into what felt like a portal to the past. The office could have been a museum exhibit. Dark wood paneling on the walls, shelves lined with leather-bound law books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. A massive mahogany desk that dominated the room like a ship in full sail. The air smelled of furniture polish and old paper, the accumulated scent of decades. Behind the desk sat Harrison Caldwell. The man matched his surroundings perfectly. He had to be at least 70 with a neatly trimmed white beard and wire-rimmed glasses perched at the end of his nose. He wore a three-piece suit that had been expensive once, probably around the time Eisenhower was president. When he looked up at Ethan, his gaze was neutral, unreadable, the eyes of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Mr. Brooks," Caldwell said, his voice was dry as autumn leaves. "You came." "I did." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. He placed it on the polished surface of the mahogany desk, where it looked small and sad and slightly ridiculous. Caldwell didn't look at the money. Instead, he slid a thick stack of papers across the desk toward Ethan. "The deed to Parcel 7B, as stipulated in your grandfather's will. Sign here and here." He pointed with a bony finger to two places marked with little red tabs. Ethan signed where indicated his hand shaking slightly. His signature looked like a child's scrawl, the writing of someone who didn't quite believe he had the right to put his name on legal documents. Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, which groaned in protest. The sound echoed in the quiet office. "Now," the old lawyer said, "let's talk about the reality of your situation. Your grandfather bought that land 30 years ago. It was cheap then. It's not worth much more now. It has no road access, no well, no septic system, no electricity. It is for all intents and purposes a piece of wilderness with a derelict military surplus hut sitting on it." Ethan felt his heart sinking. "Why did he leave it to me?" "Your grandfather was a sentimental man, Mr. Brooks. He was also a very private one. He never told me his specific intentions. He just made it very clear that on your 18th birthday, the property was to be offered to you and only you for the sum of the outstanding taxes. If you declined, it would be absorbed by the state." Caldwell paused, studying Ethan over his spectacles. "There is, however, another option. I received an inquiry about the property last week. A developer, part of a larger limited liability company, has been buying up land in that area. They are prepared to offer you $5,000 for the parcel as it stands." The words hit Ethan like a fist to the chest. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was everything he needed. An apartment, a lawyer, a real chance to fight for Riley. It was the smart choice, the logical choice, the sane choice that would solve all his immediate problems. But then he thought of his grandfather standing in his workshop with sawdust coating his work boots, teaching a 9-year-old boy how to measure twice and cut once. He thought of the careful way William had spoken, choosing his words like he chose his wood for grain and strength. And he thought of the promise he'd made to Riley just a few hours ago. "I'm going to make it a home." A motel room wasn't a home. $5,000 wouldn't buy what he'd promised his sister. "They've been buying up a lot of the old parcels." Caldwell continued, his tone giving nothing away. "Planning a resort, I believe. A golf course. They've been very persistent." The way he said persistent made it sound like a threat. 5,000 was their opening offer. It was what they thought a desperate kid would jump at. It was an insult wrapped in opportunity. "I'm not selling," Ethan said. The words came out before he'd even fully formed the thought. But once they were spoken, they felt solid, real, right. Caldwell raised one eyebrow and something flickered in his old eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "Are you certain, son, $5,000 could give you a considerable head start in life?" "I'm sure," Ethan said, his voice stronger this time. "It's mine. I want to see it." Caldwell nodded slowly. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Very well. Your grandfather would have liked that." He reached into a desk drawer and produced a large iron key, the old-fashioned kind that looked like it belonged to a castle or a dungeon. It was heavy, ornate, and covered in a fine layer of rust. "This is for the padlock on the hut. Your grandfather left it with me all those years ago." Then Caldwell slid another item across the desk, a hand-drawn map on a piece of yellowed paper that crackled when Ethan picked it up. The directions were simple but daunting. "Follow the county road west for 3 miles. Turn onto a dirt track called Old Miller Road. Walk until the road disappears. The property was another half-mile hike through the woods from there." "Good luck, Mr. Brooks," Caldwell said, standing to shake Ethan's hand. His grip was surprisingly firm for a man his age. "I have a feeling you're going to need it." The walk was longer than Ethan had expected and harder. The county road was paved but narrow, hemmed in by forest on both sides. After 3 miles, Old Miller Road appeared, and the word road turned out to be generous. It was really just 2 muddy ruts cutting into the trees, the kind of track that maybe saw a vehicle once or twice a year. Ethan followed those ruts as they wound deeper into the forest. The afternoon sun was getting low, casting long, distorted shadows through the bare branches. The temperature was dropping fast. Every step took him further from anything resembling civilization. His trash bag felt heavier with every minute. The supplies he'd bought at a small general store in Millbrook Falls, with 50 of his precious dollars, added weight to his burden. Canned food, bread, a cheap sleeping bag, basic tools. The silence was profound. No cars, no planes overhead, just the crunch of his sneakers on frozen mud and the occasional call of a bird somewhere in the darkening trees. Ethan had never been truly alone in nature before. The group home had been crowded and loud. The city had been full of people. This was different. This was isolation so complete it felt like pressure. He was terrified, but he was also walking towards something that was his. That thought was a small, warm coal in the center of his chest, keeping him moving forward. According to the map, he should reach a line of old stone walls soon. Farmers had built them a century ago to mark property boundaries, back when people actually tried to farm this rocky soil. When Ethan finally spotted the tumbled stones through the trees, his heart beat faster. This was it, his land. He pushed through a tangle of thorny bushes, branches, catching at his jacket, and emerged into a small clearing. There it was, the Quonset hut. It was bigger than he'd imagined from the grainy photo, and it was in much worse shape. The structure squatted in the clearing like some exhausted metal beast that had crawled here to die. Rust bloomed across its curved surface in angry orange patches, spreading like a disease across the corrugated steel. The 2 massive doors on the front were dented and scarred. Weeds and small saplings had grown right up to its edges, trying to reclaim it for the forest. It didn't look sturdy. It looked defeated. Ethan's heart sank toward his shoes. This wasn't a home. This was barely a shelter. This was a tomb made of rusting metal. He walked around the perimeter, the ground soft and spongy beneath his feet. A few small, grimy windows were set high on the curved walls, too high to see through. At the back, a stovepipe poked crookedly toward the darkening sky. The $5,000 offer echoed in his mind, suddenly sounding not like an insult, but like a lifeline he'd been stupid to refuse. He could still turn back, walk back to town, find a phone, call Caldwell and accept the developer's money. No one would blame him, but he had the key, the heavy iron key that his grandfather had kept for 30 years, waiting for this exact moment. It felt like a responsibility in his pocket, a trust he couldn't betray. Ethan approached the front doors. A thick chain was wrapped around the 2 handles held together by a massive padlock that was the same rusted color as the walls. He slid the key into the lock. It grated, resisted. For a terrifying moment, Ethan thought it was the wrong key, that this was all some final cosmic joke. He put his shoulder into it, turning with all his strength. There was a loud, protesting screech of metal on metal, and then a solid, satisfying clunk. The lock sprang open. The chain fell away with a heavy clang that echoed through the clearing. It took all of Ethan's weight to pull one of the huge doors open. The hinges groaned, the sound carrying through the silent forest like a warning, or a welcome. He peered inside. The interior was vast and dark, a cavern of shadows. A single beam of dusty afternoon light cut through the gloom from a crack somewhere in the roof, illuminating a universe of swirling dust motes. The air was thick and musty, smelling of damp earth and rust, and time itself trapped and fermented. The space was empty, almost empty. In the center of that huge curved interior, sitting directly in that single shaft of light, as if placed there by divine intention, was a small wooden crate. Ethan stood in the doorway, fear giving way to a powerful, prickling curiosity. The crate wasn't random debris. It was positioned, deliberate, waiting. He left his trash bag by the door and walked toward it, his footsteps echoing in the massive space. The floor was poured concrete, cracked and uneven, but solid. The crate was old, made of dark, weathered wood, with rope handles on the sides. It had no lid. Ethan looked inside. Glass jars, dozens of them. Old-fashioned canning jars packed in straw, each one sealed with a wax lid. At first he thought it was food. His practical grandfather leaving him preserved vegetables or fruit to get him through the first winter. But when he lifted one of the jars, it was too heavy, and the contents weren't peaches or beans. The jar was filled with tightly rolled bundles of cash. Old bills held together with crumbling rubber bands. Ethan stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He picked up another jar, then another. They were all the same, each one packed with money. His legs went weak. He sat down hard on the cold concrete floor. With shaking hands, he pulled one of the bundles from a jar. The rubber band snapped and a cascade of $20 bills spilled into his lap. They were soft, worn, real. He counted the bills with trembling fingers. $1,000 in a single bundle. There were at least 20 bundles in that jar, and there were at least a dozen jars in the crate. This wasn't a head start. This was a different life entirely. This was Riley's future, sitting in glass jars in the middle of nowhere. Ethan started to laugh, a strange choke sound that echoed off the curved metal walls. Then the laughter turned into something else, something deeper and more desperate. He cried for everything, for the years in the system, for the cold loneliness of the last 24 hours, for the terror and the hope and the crushing weight of it all. He cried for his parents. And he cried for the quiet, practical man who had built this strange, rusted ark for him, this secret lifeboat hidden in the middle of the woods. His grandfather hadn't just left him a piece of land, he'd left him a chance. When the tears finally stopped, Ethan saw something else at the bottom of the crate, tucked beneath the last layer of straw. A thick, leather-bound journal. On the cover, in faded gold leaf, was his grandfather's name, William Brooks. Ethan opened it with hands that still shook. The first page wasn't a journal entry, it was a letter. The handwriting was neat and precise, the script of a man who worked with his hands, but believed that words deserved the same care as wood. It was addressed to him. Leo, it began, and Ethan realized his grandfather had written this before knowing whether he'd be called Ethan or Leo or anything else. The name didn't matter, the message did. If you are reading this, it means you turned 18. It means you were strong enough to make it this far. And it means you didn't take the easy money. I knew you wouldn't. You have your mother's heart, but you have my stubbornness. That's a good combination. Reading the words felt like hearing his grandfather's voice, a faint echo across the years in the grave. This place probably doesn't look like much. The money is for you and Riley. It's everything I saved. I sold the house after your grandmother passed and lived cheap. I wanted you both to have a foundation, something the world couldn't take away. But the money is the least important thing I'm leaving you. The most important thing is this land, this hut. This is your home if you choose to make it one. The letter went on explaining that he'd bought the land cheap because of its lack of access and utilities. But he'd seen something others hadn't. He wrote about developers, even back then, sniffing around the area trying to consolidate parcels for a big project. They think this land is empty, his grandfather had written. They are wrong. Don't let them bully you, son. They will try. They will offer you money that sounds like a kingdom. But what you have here is more valuable than their resort. You just have to find it. The last line was underlined twice. The foundation is the key. Everything starts with the foundation. Ethan looked around at the cracked concrete floor, at the shadows gathering in the corners of the vast space. The foundation. What did he mean? The money was overwhelming enough to change his life and Riley's, but the letter, the mystery, was what truly captured him. This wasn't just a handout, it was a task. A puzzle left for him by a man he barely remembered, but who had clearly known him, loved him, understood him. As darkness fell, outside, Ethan made his first camp in the Quonset hut. He had no sleeping bag yet, just his thin jacket and the clothes on his back. He found a pile of old, musty canvas tarps in a corner and made a makeshift bed. The cold was profound, seeping up through the concrete and down from the metal ceiling. Every gust of wind outside sounded like something trying to peel the roof away. Ethan lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. An owl hooted somewhere. Small creatures rustled through dead leaves. He was more afraid than he'd ever been in his life. But it was a different kind of fear than he'd known in the group home. This wasn't the fear of arbitrary rules or sudden violence. This was elemental fear, the fear of being a small, warm thing in a vast, cold wilderness. And strangely, it felt cleaner, more honest. When morning came, Ethan woke stiff and freezing but alive. Pale sunlight streamed through the crack in the roof, filling the hut with hopeful light. He took $100 from one of the jars, the act feeling like both a betrayal and a necessity, and prepared to hike back to town. He had work to do, a home to build, a sister to bring home, and a mystery to solve. The foundation is the key. Somewhere in this rusted metal shell, his grandfather had hidden something more valuable than money, and Ethan was going to find it. The hardware store in Millbrook Falls smelled like metal and possibility. Ethan pushed through the door on a cold morning 3 days after finding the money, the bell above jangling to announce his arrival. The air inside was warm, heated by an old cast-iron radiator that ticked and hissed in the corner. Sawdust covered parts of the wooden floor. Tools hung from pegboards that covered entire walls, organized with the kind of precision that spoke of decades of muscle memory. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the building. Frank Holloway had to be 65 at least, with a weathered face that had seen too many winters and hands that were scarred from a lifetime of honest work. His hair was steel gray, cut short. His eyes were the blue of summer sky, sharp and intelligent despite his age. "You look lost, son," Frank said, setting down the newspaper he had been reading. "First time buying tools." Ethan nodded, suddenly aware of how young he must look, how out of place. "I'm fixing up a place. Out past Old Miller Road, the old Vance property." Recognition flickered across Frank's face. "William's grandson. Heard you'd come to claim it. Took guts to take that over the developer money." News traveled fast in small towns. Ethan shouldn't have been surprised. "I need supplies," Ethan said, "but I don't know exactly what." Frank came around the counter, moving with the careful gait of a man whose knees had earned their complaints. "Tell me what you're working with." For the next hour, Frank guided Ethan through the store with the patience of a born teacher. He explained the difference between a good axe and a cheap one, showed him how to judge the quality of a saw blade by the sound it made when you plucked it like a guitar string. He helped Ethan choose a heavy-duty tarp to patch the roof buckets or for hauling water, a propane camp stove that would work reliably even in freezing temperatures. "You'll need a good sleeping bag," Frank said, pulling one from a high shelf. "That metal building gets cold at night, cold enough to kill you if you're not careful." When everything was piled on the counter, Ethan did the math in his head and felt his stomach drop. Even with the money from the jars, he needed to be careful. He had Riley to think about, a future to build. Frank must have seen something in his face. "Tell you what," the old man said, pulling a pencil from behind his ear and doing some calculations on a paper bag. "First-time customer discount. Call it a welcome to the neighborhood gift. And if you need more later, I can set you up on credit. Your grandfather's name still means something around here." It was the first act of kindness Ethan had received that didn't come with strings attached or expectations of repayment. Something in his chest loosened slightly. "Thank you," he managed. "Don't mention it. Just promise me you'll be careful out there. That's wild country, and those developers don't take kindly to people who get in their way." Ethan left the store with his arms full and his heart a little lighter. He bought groceries at the small market down the street, canned soup, bread, peanut butter, instant coffee. Simple things that felt like luxuries after years of institutional food. The walk back to the Quonset hut was brutal. 3 miles on the county road, then the muddy track through the forest carrying his supplies that seemed to gain weight with every step. By the time Ethan reached the clearing, his arms were shaking and his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. But when he saw the hut waiting there in the trees, something shifted in his perception. It wasn't just a rusted wreck anymore. It was his rusted wreck. His project, his future taking shape in metal and determination. The next weeks blurred into a pattern of exhausting physical labor. Ethan learned by doing, by failing, by trying again. He patched the hole in the roof with the tarp, a terrifying job that involved climbing the curved exterior with a rope tied around his waist, praying the whole time that the corroded metal would hold his weight. He cleared the weeds and saplings from around the building, reclaiming the clearing, one stubborn root at a time. He found a small stream about a quarter-mile into the forest running clear and cold over smooth stones. Every day he made multiple trips hauling water back in the buckets Frank had sold him. His hands developed blisters that popped and bled and eventually hardened into calluses. He learned to chop wood. The first day he nearly took off his own foot with the axe. By the end of the first week, he could split logs with something approaching efficiency. The pile of firewood grew beside the hut, a tangible measure of progress. In the back corner of the Quonset, Ethan discovered an old wood-burning stove buried under tarps and forgotten debris. It was a beautiful thing despite the rust cast iron with the ornate scrollwork on the doors. He spent 2 full days cleaning it, scrubbing away decades of neglect, polishing it until he could see his reflection in the dark metal. Installing the stovepipe through the existing hole in the roof took another day of cursing and problem-solving. But when it was finally done, when he lit the first fire and watched the flames catch and grow, the warmth that spread through the vast space felt like a miracle. The cold retreated. The damp withdrew. Light danced on the curved metal walls, transforming the hut from a tomb into something that might someday, with enough work, become a home. Every few days, Ethan hiked into town to call Riley from the payphone outside the general store. Those conversations kept him going when the work felt impossible, when his muscles screamed and his resolve wavered. "You sound different, Ethan," Riley said during one call in early April. "How?" "I don't know. Older, less scared." "I'm still scared," he told her honestly. "But it's a good scared now, like I'm scared of failing, not scared of everything." "When can I come see it?" The question stabbed into his chest. "Soon. I'm making it nice for you. You'll have your own room, windows looking out at the forest. It's going to be good Riles, I promise." After he hung up, Ethan stood in the spring sunlight and felt the weight of that promise like a physical thing. 6 more years. Riley had 6 more years until she aged out. He had to be ready by then. Had to have not just a house, but a real home. Had to be stable enough, established enough that the courts would grant him custody. It felt impossible. But then a month ago, owning land had felt impossible too. The letter from the developers arrived on a Tuesday in early June. Caldwell called Ethan into town to receive it in person, his weathered face grave. The envelope was expensive, cream-colored paper with an embossed logo of a stylized mountain peak. Cascade Ridge Development, LLC. The letter inside was professionally written, full of corporate language that tried to sound friendly while making very clear threats. They were offering $25,000 now, 5 times their original offer. The letter mentioned that if Ethan refused, they were prepared to petition the county to seize the land under eminent domain for utility access. They claimed his unimproved structure constituted a blight on the area and posed environmental hazards. "It's a bluff," Caldwell said, watching Ethan read. "Mostly, but they have lawyers and money. They can make your life very difficult if they want to." Ethan felt anger rising hot and bitter in his throat. A month ago, he would have been terrified by this letter. The old Ethan, the group home kid, would have folded immediately. $25,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined having. It would solve everything. Apartment, lawyer, stable income. He could fight for Riley from a position of strength. But the new Ethan, the one with calloused hands and sore muscles, the one who'd hauled water and chopped wood and learned that he was stronger than he'd ever known, that Ethan was different. "What did my grandfather mean?" he asked, pushing the developer's letter aside. In his letter, he said the foundation was the key. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan over his glasses. Your grandfather was a master carpenter and stonemason before he retired. He worked on a lot of the old dam projects in this state back in the 40s and 50s. He knew geology. He knew how to read land the way most people read books. If William said the foundation was important, he meant it literally. The words echoed in Ethan's mind, then all the way back to the hut. The foundation. The concrete floor. What was he missing that evening as the sun set and painted the forest gold? Ethan began to search. He swept the entire concrete floor clean of dust and debris, then got down on his hands and knees and began examining every inch of it. Most of the cracks were natural, the result of decades of freeze-thaw cycles. But in the far back corner, partially hidden by where he'd positioned the wood stove, he found something different. A line. Perfectly straight. Too straight to be a crack. His heart began to pound. He traced the line with his fingers, finding 3 more sides. A square roughly 4 feet on each side cut into the concrete with geometric precision. It was a seam, a hatch, a door. Ethan spent an hour trying to find a way to open it, running his hands over every inch of the square, looking for a handle or a latch. There was nothing. The concrete was perfectly flush with the surrounding floor. Then he remembered something his grandfather had taught him back when they'd built that birdhouse together. About counterweights and leverage. About making heavy things movable through clever engineering. He found a long piece of timber in the debris pile outside and used it as a lever, positioning it at the edge of the seam and pressing down with all his weight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then with a grinding groan of stone on stone, the massive concrete slab began to tilt. Slowly, ponderously, it rose on some hidden hinge mechanism, revealing a dark square opening in the foundation. An iron ladder made of rebar descended into blackness. The air that rose from below smelled of cold stone and deep earth untouched by sunlight 4 decades. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and began to climb down. The cellar was small, perhaps 10 feet square, with the walls made of carefully fitted fieldstone. His grandfather's work unmistakably. The craftsmanship was beautiful even in the harsh beam of the flashlight, each stone chosen and placed with the eye of an artist. In the center of the cellar, sitting on a pedestal of stacked stone, was a heavy metal lockbox. Next to it stood a glass jar sealed tightly against moisture. Inside the jar was a letter. Ethan's hands shook as he opened the jar and unfolded the paper. His grandfather's handwriting, again still precise, still careful. Ethan, the letter began. If you found this, you were paying attention. Good man, I built this hut for a reason. Not just to hide the money, not just to give you a roof. I built it on this exact spot for what's under it. The words blurred as Ethan read faster, his breath coming quick and shallow. When I was a young man, I worked on a geological survey team for the state. We mapped this whole region for the War Department. They wanted to know where the water was in case they needed to build bases or camps in a hurry. Most of this area is shale and granite, worthless for water. But there's a vein of something else running under this ridge, a deep aquifer, some of the purest spring water in the entire state. The survey was buried, classified by the state to prevent a water rush. Too many people fighting over too little resource, they said. But I never forgot the location. I never forgot what was down here. This land sits directly on top of the main reservoir. You don't just own 2.5 acres of land, son. You own the water underneath it. All of it. The water rights for this parcel were never separated from the deed because nobody knew the water was there. Nobody but me. Ethan sat down hard on the cold stone floor, the letter shaking in his hands. Water. The developers weren't building a resort with a golf course without a massive private water source. They couldn't. The area was too dry, the municipal systems too old and overtaxed. They weren't after his worthless piece of land. They were after what was underneath it, and they'd been trying to steal it from him for $25,000. The lockbox contained the proof. His grandfather's copies of the original geological surveys, yellowed and fragile, but meticulously preserved. Water tables showing the aquifer running deep beneath the ridge, and a carefully documented legal opinion commissioned years ago from a water rights specialist, confirming that the owner of Parcel 7B controlled access to the aquifer. His grandfather had been planning this for 30 years. He'd built a fortress to protect something he knew would become valuable. He'd hidden the secret until Ethan was old enough to fight for it. The rage came first, white hot and clarifying. These people, this faceless corporation, had looked at him and seen an easy mark. An orphan kid they could crush. They'd underestimated him. More importantly, they'd underestimated William Brooks. Ethan climbed back up the ladder and walked out into the twilight. The forest was alive with spring sounds, birds calling, insects beginning their evening songs. He stood in the clearing and looked at the Quonset hut with new eyes. His grandfather hadn't just left him money and land. He'd left him power, leverage. The one thing the developers couldn't do without, and the one thing they couldn't easily take. The next morning, Ethan walked into Caldwell's office and laid the contents of the lockbox on the mahogany desk. The old lawyer read through the documents, slowly stopping occasionally to polish his glass and read sections again. When he finally looked up, there was something like wonder in his eyes. "William M. Caldwell," said softly, speaking to a ghost, "you magnificent bastard." Then he turned to Ethan. "This changes everything. You understand that this isn't a defensive position anymore. This is leverage. We don't just have to tell them no. We can set our own terms." The next months were a crash course in a world Ethan had never known existed, a world of lawyers and hydrology reports and corporate negotiations. Caldwell hired a water rights specialist from Albany, paying her with money from the jars. Ethan learned words like riparian rights and commercial extraction permits. He sat through meetings where men in expensive suits used complicated language to say simple things. Cascade Ridge fought back. They tried to bury Ethan in paperwork to challenge the validity of his grandfather's survey to find any crack in the armor William had so carefully constructed. But his grandfather had been too meticulous. His work was flawless. Their whole case had been built on the assumption that nobody knew about the water. Once it became clear that Ethan not only knew but had proof, their strategy crumbled. While the legal battle raged in conference rooms and filing cabinets, Ethan kept working on the Quonset hut. The physical labor kept him sane when the legal complexities threatened to overwhelm him. He bought a small used generator from Frank, which gave him power for lights and tools. He taught himself to frame walls by reading books from the town library and asking questions of anyone who would answer. Frank became his unofficial mentor, giving advice freely and letting Ethan buy supplies on credit when cash ran low. Ethan built a small bedroom for himself, framing it against one curved wall and installing insulation to keep out the cold. He built a larger room for Riley, positioning it where she'd have the best view of the forest. He framed spaces for a kitchen and bathroom rough work that would need refinement but established the bones of a real home. He salvaged wooden planks from a collapsed barn down the road, spent weeks sanding them smooth and laid them as flooring. The Quonset was no longer a cold, empty cavern. It was taking shape, taking on character, becoming something that looked less like a relic and more like a dwelling. The town noticed. People in Millbrook Falls started asking how the project was coming. They'd heard the rumors, of course. The city developers trying to push around the quiet kid who was fixing up the old Vance place. Small towns had their own immune system. They didn't always take kindly to outsiders trying to throw their weight around. Help started arriving. A retired electrician showed up one Saturday morning and spent the whole day teaching Ethan how to properly ground wiring. A woman Ethan had never met dropped off a box of old kitchen supplies, pots and pans and dishes that had belonged to her mother. Frank let him use the workshop behind the hardware store to build kitchen cabinets, providing guidance and the occasional correction when Ethan's measurements were off. They weren't just being kind, they were choosing a side. They were choosing him. In late November, as the first snow began to fall, Cascade Ridge's lawyers finally requested a meeting. Ethan walked into Caldwell's office to find two men in expensive suits waiting. They looked uncomfortable in the old-fashioned room, out of place among the law books and wooden filing cabinets. They tried charm first. They talked about community and progress and partnership. Ethan sat quietly and listened, watching them perform. When they finally slid their new offers across the table, the number took his breath away. $250,000, $250,000. More money than most people in Millbrook Falls would see in a lifetime. Enough to disappear, to start over anywhere, to give Riley every opportunity she could ever want. Caldwell looked at Ethan, his expression carefully neutral. "Your decision," the old lawyer said. "Whatever you choose, I'll support you." For a long moment, Ethan sat with the offer in front of him. He thought about what that money could buy: security, safety, freedom from struggle. But then he thought about the feeling of splitting wood on a cold morning, the satisfaction of watching the pile grow. He thought about the pride he felt looking at the walls he'd built with his own hands straight and true. He thought about his grandfather and the 30-year game of chess he'd been playing against people who thought land was just a commodity. And he thought about Riley and the promise he'd made on a payphone 6 months ago. "I'm going to make it a home." "No," Ethan said. The suits stared at him. Their lawyer's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon." "The answer is no. I'm not selling the land. I'm not selling the water rights." Ethan pulled out the counter-proposal he and Caldwell had prepared. "But I will lease you utility access. You can run your pipes through a corner of my property, and in exchange you'll pay a yearly fee. You'll fund the drilling and installation of a commercial-grade well and pump system on my property, which I will own and control. You'll connect my home to the electrical grid at your expense." He took a breath, looking each of them in the eye. "And finally, you'll establish a community trust administered by a local board to ensure that residents of this town have priority access to clean water at reduced rates. Forever." The men were speechless. They looked at the proposal, then at Ethan in his worn flannel shirt and work boots, then at their lawyer. They were seeing a kid in second-hand clothes dictating terms to their multi-million-dollar corporation. They were seeing a ghost they couldn't bully or buy. They left without giving an answer. But everyone in the room knew the truth. Ethan had won. That night, back at the Quonset hut, Ethan sat by the wood stove and read more of his grandfather's journal. He found entries from 1942, when William had been part of the Geological Survey team. Entries about discovering the aquifer, about the government, classifying the information about a young man remembering coordinates for a day 30 years in the future. He found an entry from December 1970, written 2 weeks after Ethan's parents had died. "I can't raise them," William had written. "My heart is broken and my body is failing. But I can give them a foundation. I can give them something to build on." The last entry was dated February 5th, 1971, 2 weeks before William died. "I placed the money today, put it right in the only shaft of light in the whole building. Ethan will see it. He's a smart boy. He has a good heart. If he's reading this after I'm gone, I want him to know. I'm proud of him. I always will be. Build your foundation strong, son. Then build your life on top of it." Ethan closed the journal and looked around the Quonset hut, at the walls rising, at the stove burning steady, at the beginning of something that was starting to look like a future. His grandfather had left him more than money or land. He'd left him a puzzle he knew Ethan was strong enough to solve. And in solving it, Ethan had found something more valuable than water or cash. He'd found himself. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall, covering the forest in white silence. Inside, the fire burned warm. Ethan picked up a pencil and began to sketch plans for Riley's room, drawing careful lines on graph paper, measuring twice before committing to anything the way his grandfather had taught him so many years ago. The foundation was strong now. It was time to build the rest. Winter came to the Catskills like an old friend who'd forgotten how to be gentle. Snow piled up around the Quonset hut in drifts that reached halfway up the curved walls. The forest went silent except for the wind, which spoke in a language older than words. Inside, Ethan kept the wood stove burning day and night, feeding it logs from the pile he'd spent autumn building. December arrived with news from Caldwell. Cascade Ridge had accepted the terms. All of them. The legal documents were being drawn up. They'd fought for weeks trying to negotiate individual points, but Ethan and Caldwell had held firm. The developers had invested too much to walk away now. Finding and securing a new water source would cost them more than agreeing to Ethan's proposal. The day the contracts were signed, Ethan didn't feel triumphant. He felt quiet, settled, like something that had been vibrating inside him for months had finally gone still. He walked back to the hut through fresh snow, his boots leaving the only tracks on the newly plowed access road that Cascade Ridge had been required to install as part of the agreement. When he reached the clearing, he stopped and just looked at his home. The power company had come the day before, running lines from the new road all the way to the building. Ethan had watched them work, had helped dig post holes when they had signed the papers transferring ownership of the electrical connection to his name. His name, on official utility documents. He went inside and stood by the door, hand on the light switch. For a moment, he just breathed, remembering the first time he'd entered this space. The darkness, the the single shaft of dusty light, the crate waiting like a promise. Then he flipped the switch. Light flooded the interior. Clean, bright, steady electric light that banished every shadow, that made the curved metal walls gleam, that transformed the space into something real and solid and unmistakably alive. Ethan stood in the middle of his home and looked at what he'd built. The walls he'd framed and insulated, the smooth wooden floor he'd sanded and sealed, the wood stove he'd restored now sitting like a beating heart in its designated space, the framed openings for the kitchen and bathroom waiting for plumbing that would come in spring. Riley's room complete except for furniture with 2 windows looking out at the forest. The work would never be finished. There would always be something that needed fixing, improving, maintaining. But this was a home now, a real one. Over the winter, Ethan prepared his case for custody of Riley. He wasn't just an aged-out foster kid anymore. He was a property owner, a business owner technically, with documented income from the water lease. He had a home that had passed inspection, a bank account that held most of his grandfather's money in trust for Riley's future, and a growing file of letters from the community. Caldwell wrote one formal and legal, attesting to Ethan's character and business acumen. Frank wrote one in his careful carpenter's hand, talking about watching a boy become a man through honest work. The retired electrician wrote one. The woman who'd given him the kitchen supplies wrote one. Even the county inspector, who'd examined the Quonset for the habitability permit, wrote a letter noting that he'd rarely seen such careful attention to detail in a renovation. In March, 1 year after standing on the steps of Northwood Group Home with everything he owned in a trash bag, Ethan appeared before a family court judge to petition for guardianship of his sister. The courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, less imposing. The judge was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She read through his file while Ethan sat at the defendant's table, hands folded, trying not to shake. Riley sat in the gallery behind him, wearing the nicest dress the group home had provided for the hearing. She was 13 now, taller than Ethan remembered, but still his little sister. Still the person he was doing all of this for. The judge asked questions about his income, about his home, about his plans for Riley's education and health care. Ethan answered each one carefully, honestly, the way Caldwell had coached him. He didn't embellish. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just told the truth. When the judge finally looked up from her papers and announced her decision, Ethan felt the world tilt and resettle around him. Granted, guardianship granted effective immediately. Riley made a sound behind him, half sob and half laugh. Ethan stood on legs that felt like water and turned to see his sister standing too, tears streaming down her face, a smile breaking across it like sunrise. They met in the middle of the courtroom, and Ethan wrapped his arms around her and held on while she cried into his shoulder. "We're going home," he whispered. "We're going home, Riles." The drive back to Millbrook Falls took 3 hours in Frank's borrowed pickup truck. Riley sat pressed against the passenger window, watching the landscape transform from city to suburbs to wilderness. She didn't say much, just watched, taking it all in. When the truck turned onto the access road and began climbing toward the Quonset, Ethan felt his heart beating faster. He'd worked so hard to make it ready for this moment. But what if it wasn't enough? What if she hated it? What if she took one look at this metal building in the middle of nowhere and realized her brother had lost his mind? The hut came into view through the trees. New windows caught the afternoon light. Smoke curled from the chimney. The small porch Ethan had built just last week stood solid and level in front of the door. Riley sat up straighter. Her hand found the door handle. When Frank stopped the truck, she climbed out slowly, staring at the building. "You did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, you actually did it. You built us a house." "It's not a house," Ethan said, coming around the truck to stand beside her. "It's a Quonset hut." Riley looked at him, then back at the building, then at him again. She grabbed his hand and held it tight. "No," she said firmly. "It's a home." That first night together, Ethan cooked dinner on the propane stove he'd installed in the kitchen-to-be. Just soup and bread, simple food, but it tasted better than anything he could remember eating. They sat at the table Frank had helped him build, and they didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Just being in the same space, breathing the same air was enough. After dinner, Riley explored her room for the 3rd time, touching the walls, looking out the windows, testing the bed Ethan had built with his own hands. He stood in the doorway watching her, remembering the last time he'd seen her through glass and wire mesh, remembering the promise he'd made. I'm going to make it a home. He'd kept that promise. Against all odds, against all reason, he'd kept it. That night, alone in his own room after Riley had fallen asleep, Ethan returned to his grandfather's journal. He'd been reading it slowly all winter, savoring the entries, getting to know William Brooks through his own words. Near the end of the journal, he found an entry dated February 5th, 1971, the day before his grandfather died. I won't live to see what Ethan becomes, William had written in a hand that shook slightly, the first sign of weakness Ethan had seen in any of the entries. But I know he'll be strong. I know he'll fight. I know he'll build. I'm leaving him a puzzle because puzzles make us think, and thinking makes us grow. The money will give him a start. The land will give him a place. But the foundation, the real foundation, is inside him. It always was. If you're reading this, Ethan, after I'm gone, I want you to know something. I'm proud of you. I always will be. You have everything you need to build a good life, not an easy one. Not a simple one, but a good one built on solid ground. Remember what I taught you: measure twice, cut once, build your foundation strong, and then build your life on top of it. The entry ended there. The next pages were blank. Ethan sat with the journal open on his lap, tears running down his face in the lamplight. His grandfather had known. Somehow he'd known that Ethan would make it, would find the strength, would solve the puzzle, and claim the inheritance that was so much more than money or land. The real inheritance was the test itself, the challenge, the opportunity to discover that he was stronger than he'd ever imagined. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were good. Ethan and Riley built a life in the Quonset hut, in the shadow of the mountains, in a community that had accepted them as their own. Riley flourished, away from the group home, away from the constant anxiety and institutional coldness. She became the person she'd always been meant to be: smart, curious, determined. She graduated from the local high school at the top of her class. She got a scholarship to college, came home on weekends, brought friends who looked at the Quonset hut with fascination and envy. Ethan kept building. He finished the bathroom, installed real plumbing connected to the well that Cascade Ridge had drilled according to their agreement. He completed the kitchen, laying tile by hand, building cabinets that fit perfectly into the curved walls. He added solar panels to supplement the electrical connection, making the home nearly self-sufficient. He met Sarah in the town library on a rainy afternoon in 1975. She was shelving books. He was researching advanced carpentry techniques. They started talking and didn't stop for 3 hours. They were married 6 months later in a ceremony held on the porch of the Quonset with the whole town in attendance. Their son was born in 1987. They named him William. Life had seasons, good years and hard ones. Sarah died of cancer in 2001, and Ethan stood on the porch alone for the first time in decades, looking at the forest, unable to cry because grief was too big for tears. William, their son, grew up and moved away. He wanted the city, wanted opportunities that couldn't be found in Millbrook Falls. Ethan understood, even as it hurt to watch him go. Riley became a lawyer working in Albany, but visiting every month. She never forgot where she came from, never forgot the promise that had been kept. In 2010, William had a son and named him Carter. For a few years, Ethan was a grandfather, and life felt complete again. Then William died in a car accident in 2015. His ex-wife, overwhelmed and unprepared, put Carter into the foster system. Ethan tried to get custody, but he was 61, and the courts deemed him too old, too isolated. Carter disappeared into the same machinery that had once ground up Ethan and Riley. The years that followed were the hardest. Ethan kept the Quonset running, kept the wood stove burning, kept waiting for the day he knew would come. Now, sitting on the porch in March of 2024 with Carter beside him, holding the deed to the property, Ethan felt the circle completing. "You're giving me the Quonset?" Carter asked again, his voice cracking. "The land, the water rights, everything. The same way my grandfather gave it to me," Ethan said. "Not as a gift, as a responsibility, as a foundation to build your life on. But I don't know what to do. I don't know how to build anything." "Neither did I." Ethan put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. "But you'll learn. You'll make mistakes. You'll want to quit. But you won't, because you're a Brooks and we don't want quit. We build." Carter was crying now, silently, tears cutting tracks down his young face. "What if I fail?" "Then you get up and try again. That's what the foundation is for, to hold you up when you fall, to give you something solid to stand on when everything else is shaking." Homo Ethan stood his knees protesting, but still strong enough. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the forest, at the land his grandfather had chosen 70 years ago, with an eye toward a future he'd never see. My foundation isn't just concrete and stone, Ethan said. It's every choice I made to stay when I could have run. Every wall I built when I didn't know how. Every morning I woke up scared and cold and kept going anyway. He turned back to Carter. Your foundation is yours to build. It doesn't matter what you start with. A trash bag, a $5 deed, a broken heart. You have the capacity to build a life of meaning and purpose. It will be hard. It will be lonely. You'll want to quit. But every nail you hammer, every wall you raise makes you stronger. And one day you'll stand on this porch, you'll look out at what you built, and you'll realize something. What? Carter whispered. That you were never broken. You were always the foundation. The wind moved through the trees carrying the scent of thawing earth and new growth. Spring was coming to the mountains again the way it always did. The cycle continuing, the seasons turning. Inside the Quonset hut, 3 generations of work waited. The walls William had dreamed of. The home Ethan had built. The future Carter would shape. The foundation was strong. It would hold. Ethan sat back down in his rocking chair, picked up his coffee, and watched his grandson walk into the Quonset to see his new home for the first time. Through the open door, he could see the boy's face change as he took it in, the fear giving way to wonder, the despair transforming into something that might, with time and work, become hope. It was enough. It was more than enough. On the small table beside Ethan's chair lay his grandfather's journal, its leather cover worn soft by decades of handling. Beside it, a new journal, empty pages waiting to be filled with Carter's story. The foundation had been passed, the legacy secured, the circle somehow impossibly complete. Ethan closed his eyes and let the spring sun warm his face, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice on the wind, approving, proud at peace. Well done, son. Well done. The trees whispered their agreement. The mountains stood witness. And in the Quonset hut, a new story was beginning, built on the foundation of all the stories that had come before. The work would never be finished. But that was the point. That was the gift. The foundation wasn't just something you built. It was something you became. And then when the time came, it was something you passed on. Ethan Brooks opened his eyes and looked at the Quonset hut one more time, seeing it as it had been, and as it was, and as it would be. Rust and metal and stubbornness and love all forged together into something that would outlast them all. His grandfather had been right about everything. The foundation was the key. It always had been. And the work of building, of becoming, of passing it forward, that work was never done. That was what made it worth doing.